I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my honor to welcome you to our celebration of Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich first read at the Poetry Center in 1958, and her first job teaching poetry was here at the Y in 1967, and she returned often over the years. Before a solo reading in the 1990s, she reminisced about an evening of Yiddish poetry that had taken place here many years before, recalling for a contemporary audience the powerful presence of poet Kadia Molodovsky as a tiny woman with an enormous handbag. Before another appearance some years later, she asked the high school students in the audience, many of whom were attending their very first poetry reading, to listen to her not primarily for meaning, but for the sounds of words, the ways they play off each other, the voices and images they throw out, and the moments of silence between them. For this is the body and soul of a poem, she said, beyond any theme or subject. One quick programming note now. Gully Cannell sends his regrets, but he's fallen ill and is unable to participate tonight. And before we begin, I'd like to thank all the other participants, including two of Adrienne's sons, Jacob and Pablo, for guiding us through her poems and biography, and also our co-sponsors, the Academy of American Poets, the Poetry Society of America, Poets House, the Barclay Agency, and finally, W.W. Norton, whose devotion to Adrienne's work speaks for itself. And now please welcome Mark Doty.
Just a few years ago, when Adrienne Rich received the National Book Foundation's Medal for Distinguished Achievement, I was lucky enough to present her with the award. And this meant that I was standing on a stage like this one, praising her work, and all the time very much aware of a small figure to my left, in the shadows, the wings, looking with such intent attention at me, listening so carefully. And when I had finished, Adrienne walked out onto the stage slowly, stood before me, and bowed her head so that I could put the medal around her neck. As she dipped her head, she gave me a look that might be one of the most complicated expressions I have ever seen on a human face. It meant many things. It meant that she was thoroughly aware of the irony of bowing her head to a man. It meant that there was a delicious irony in two outsiders there on stage in Cipriani, for heaven's sakes, across the street from Wall Street. It meant that there is an irony about all medals, all awards, that poets know that those things are to be taken with a large measure of salt. And it meant that she was utterly delighted to be recognized in that way. Just not too long after that, Adrienne came to Rutgers, where I teach in New Brunswick, New Jersey, to read for us. And we invited two advanced poetry workshops, undergrads, to come and talk with her in the afternoon. Now, we had very carefully planned the schedule for this event because Adrienne needed time. She was in pain from arthritis, needed time to rest in between events. I don't think she rested once. She was having a very good time. When the classes came together, the students were thrilled at the idea of being able to speak with this person whose work they'd read in so many classes, who they knew was one of the major writers of our time. But being good Jersey kids, they were not cowed and had many questions. Adrienne sat in the front of the room with a look that I can only describe as entirely unguarded. They felt they could ask her anything. And with each question, she would pause. You could see her reflect. These were not extraordinary questions, but it was clear to me that every one was answered as if she had never been asked that before. What did she think today about that question? And one young woman in the back of the room said that she was so in awe of everything this writer had tackled. She said, "Aren't you afraid of anything?" And Adrienne laughed, and she said, "I'm afraid of everything." That duality of courage and vulnerability seems to me a marker of these extraordinary poems, a poet who can stand at some distance from human experience with a kind of keen oversight and at the same time be deeply embedded in relationship, in the moment and in the larger view. I'm going to read one of those poems that seems to me to embody something of what it is to be conscious in our time, what it is to be aware. I think it's one of the great poems of the second half of the 20th century. It's from The Dream of a Common Language. It's called Transcendental, Etude. And I will a couple of times stop for a drink of water during the reading because I got off an airplane today. So. Transcendental Etude. This August evening, I've been driving over back roads fringed with Queen Anne's lace, my car startling young deer in the meadows. One gave a hoarse intake of her breath, and all 4 fawns sprang after her into the dark maples. 3 months from today, they'll be fair game for the hit-and-run hunters, glorying in a weekend's destructive power, triggers fingered by drunken gunmen, sometimes so inept as to leave the shattered animal stunned in her blood. But then, evening deep in summer, the deer are still alive and free, nibbling apples from early laden boughs, so weighed, so englobed with already yellowing fruit, they seem eternal, Hesperidian in the clear-tuned, cricket-throbbing air. Later, I stood in the dooryard, my nerves singing the immense fragility of all this sweetness, this green world already sentimentalized, photographed, advertised to death. Yet it persists, stubbornly beyond the fake of Vermont of antique barn boards glazed into discotheques, artificial snow, the sick Vermont of children conceived in apathy, grown to winters of rot-gut violence, poverty gnashing its teeth like a blind cat at their lives. Still, it persists. Turning off into a dirt road from the raw cuts bulldozed through a quiet village for the tourist run to Canada, I've sat on a stone fence above a great soft, sloping field of musing heifers, a farm stand slanting its planes calmly in the calm light, a dead elm raising bleached arms above a green so dense with life, minute, momentary life. Slugs, moles, pheasants, gnats, spiders, moths, hummingbirds, groundhogs, butterflies. A lifetime is too narrow to understand it all, beginning with the huge rock shelves that underlie all life. No one ever told us we had to study our lives, make of our lives a study, as if learning natural history, music, that we should begin with the simple exercises first and slowly go on trying the hard ones, practicing till strength and accuracy became one with the daring to leap into transcendence, take the chance of breaking down the wild arpeggio or faulting the full sentence of the fugue. And in fact, we can't live like that. We take on everything at once before we've even begun to read or mark time. We're forced to begin in the midst of the hard movement, the one already sounding as we are born. At most, we're allowed a few months of simply listening to the simple line of a woman's voice singing a child against her heart. Everything else is too soon, too sudden, the wrenching apart, that woman's heartbeat heard ever after from a distance, the loss of that ground note echoing whenever we are happy or in despair. Everything else seems beyond us. We aren't ready for it. Nothing that was said is true for us, caught naked in the argument, the counterpoint, trying to sight read what our fingers can't keep up with, learn by heart what we can't read. And yet it is this we were born to. We aren't virtuosi or child prodigies. There are no prodigies in this realm, only a half-blind, stubborn cleaving to the timbre, the tones of what we are, even when all the texts describe it differently. And we're not performers, like Liszt, competing against the world for speed and brilliance. The 79-year-old pianist said when I asked her, what makes a virtuoso? Competitiveness. The longer I live, the more I mistrust theatricality, the false glamour cast by performance, the more I know it's poverty beside the truths we are salvaging from the splitting open of our lives. The woman who sits, watching, listening, eyes moving in the darkness, is rehearsing in her body, hearing out in her blood, a score touched off in her, perhaps by some words, a few chords from the stage, a tale only she can tell. But there come times, perhaps this is one of them, when we have to take ourselves more seriously or die. When we have to pull back from the incantations, rhythms we've moved to thoughtlessly, and disenthrall ourselves, bestow ourselves to silence, or a severer listening, cleansed of oratory, formulas, choruses, laments, static crowning the wires. We cut the wires, find ourselves in free fall, as if our true home were the undimensional solitudes, the rift in the great nebula. No one who survives to speak new language has avoided this, the cutting away of an old force that held her rooted to an old ground, the pitch of utter loneliness, where she herself and all creation seem equally dispersed, weightless, her being a cry to which no echo comes or can ever come. But in fact, we were always like this, rootless, dismembered. Knowing it makes the difference. Birth stripped our birthright from us, tore us from a woman, from women, from ourselves, so early on. And the whole chorus throbbing at our ears like midges told us nothing, nothing of origins, nothing we needed to know, nothing that could remember us. Only that it is unnatural, the homesickness for a woman, for ourselves, for that acute joy at the shadow her head and arms cast on a wall, her heavy or slender thighs on which we lay, flesh against flesh, eyes steady on the face of love, smell of her milk, her sweat, terror of her disappearance, all fused in this hunger for the element they have called most dangerous, to be lifted, breath-taken, on her breast, to rock within her, even if beaten back, stranded again, to apprehend in a sudden brine-clear thought, trembling like a tiny, orbed, endangered egg sac of a new world. This is what she was to me, and this is how I can love myself, as only a woman can love me. Homesick for myself, for her. As later the heat wave breaks, the clear tones of the world manifest, cloud, bough, wall, insect, the very soul of light, homesick as the fluted vault of desire articulates itself. I am the lover and the loved, home and wanderer, she who splits firewood and she who knocks, a stranger in the storm. Two women, eye to eye, measuring each other's spirits, each other's limitless desire. A whole new poetry beginning here. Vision begins to happen in such a life, as if a woman quietly walked away from the argument and jargon in a room, and sitting down in the kitchen began turning in her lap bits of yarn, calico, and velvet scraps, laying them out absently on the scrubbed boards in the lamplight, with small rainbow-colored shells sent in cotton wool from somewhere far away, and skeins of milkweed from the nearest meadow, original domestic silk, the finest findings, and the dark blue petal of the petunia, and the dry, dark-bound face of seaweed, not forgotten either, the shed silver whisker of the cat, the spiral of paper wasp nest curling beside the finch's yellow feather. Such a composition has nothing to do with eternity, the striving for greatness, brilliance. Only with the musing of a mind one with her body, experienced fingers quietly pushing dark against bright, silk against roughness, putting the tenets of a life together with no mere will to mastery, only care for the many-lived, unending forms in which she finds herself. Becoming now the shard of broken glass, slicing light in a corner, dangerous to flesh. Now the plentiful, soft leaf that wrapped round the throbbing finger soothes the wound. And now the stone foundation, rock shelf further forming, underneath everything that grows.
I met Adrienne Rich 5 years ago when she chose my second book for publication. And then we used to hang out at the Warwick Hotel in this restaurant, and I was always struck by how genuine and warm she was. After she passed away, I've hear her poems, read her poems, hear people talk about her, even as far down as once I was in Cape Town, South Africa. This was in September, and this was for a literary festival, and a woman in her 50s approached me, and she said, "May I hug you?" And I said, "Sure." I didn't know her. It was the first time I met her. I said, "Sure, but why?" And she said, You used to know Adrienne Rich. You saw her and you talked to her. I want to hug the woman who saw and shared conversations with Adrienne Rich. Later, I asked these other South African writers if they looked to what American poet they looked to for guidance as models, and they all said Adrienne Rich. She really helped us figure out a way to engage through poetry. So I often think about Adrienne Rich, who often, when I read her poems, wrenches me from cynicism and resignation, who reassures us that poetry matters, and like a small stone to a river, can have global agitations whose waves grow more resonant through time. She has given us permission to wield poetry not as analgesic, but as a weapon, as a call to arms, as a means to awaken our fatigued consciousness and fuel our blood. I'm going to read The Phenomenology of Anger. One, the freedom of the wholly mad to smear and play with their madness, write with their fingers, dipped in it the length of a room, which is not, of course, the freedom you have, walking on Broadway to stop and turn back or go on 10 blocks, 20 blocks, but feels enviable, maybe, to the compromised, curled in the placenta of the real, which was to feed and which is strangling her. 2, trying to light a log that's lain in the damp as long as this house has stood. Even with dry sticks, I can't get started, even with thorns. I twist last year into a knot of old headlines. This rose won't bloom. How does a pile of rags the machinist wiped his hand on feel in its cupboard, hour after hour? Each day during the heat wave, they took the temperature of the hammer. I huddled fugitive in the warm, sweet simmer of the hay, muttering, come. 3. Flat heartland of winter. The moon men come back from the moon. The firemen come out of the fire. Time without a taste, time without decisions, self-hatred, a monotone in the mind. The shallowness of a life lived in exile, even in the hot countries. Cleaver, staring into a window full of knives. 4. White light splits the room, table, window, lampshade. You. My hands sticky in a new way, menstrual blood seeming to leak from your side. Will the judges try to tell me which was the blood of whom? 5. Madness, suicide, murder. Is there no way out but these? The enemy, always just out of sight, snowshoeing the next forest, shrouded in a snowy blur, abominable snowman, at once the most destructive and the most elusive being, gunning down the babies at my lie, vanishing in the face of confrontation. The prince of air and darkness, computing body counts, masturbating in the factory of facts. 6. Fantasies of murder. Not enough. To kill is to cut off from pain, but the killer goes on hurting. Not enough. When I dream of meeting the enemy, this is my dream. White, acetylene ripples from my body, effortlessly released, perfectly trained on the true enemy, raking his body down to the thread of existence, burning away his lie, leaving him in a new world. A changed man. 7. I suddenly see the world is no longer viable. You are out there burning the crops with some new sublimate. This morning you left the bed we still share and went out to spread impotence upon the world. I hate you. I hate the mask you wear, your eyes assuming a depth they do not possess, drawing me into the grotto of your skull, the landscape of bone. I hate your words. They make me think of fake revolutionary bills, crisp imitation parchment they sell at battlefields. Last night, in this room, weeping, I asked you, what are you feeling? Do you feel anything? Now, in the torsion of your body, as you defoliate the fields we lived from, I have your answer. 8. Dog-eared earth. Worm-eaten moon. A pale cross-hatching of silver lies like a wire screen on the black water. All these phenomena are temporary. I would have loved to live in a world of women and men gaily in collusion with green leaves, stalks, building mineral cities, transparent domes, little huts of woven grass, each with its own pattern, a conspiracy to coexist with the Crab Nebula, the exploding universe, the mind. 9. The only real love I have ever felt was for children and other women. Everything else was lust, pity, self-hatred, pity, lust. This is a woman's confession. Now look again at the face of Botticelli's Venus, Cali, the Judith of Chartres, with her so-called smile. 10. How we are burning up our lives. Testimony. The subway hurtling to Brooklyn, her head on her knees, asleep or drugged. La via del tren subterráneo es peligrosa. Many sleep the whole way. Others sit, staring holes of fire into the air. Others plan rebellion. Night after night, awake in prison. My mind licked at the mattress like a flame till the cell block went up roaring. Thoreau setting fire to the woods, every act of becoming conscious it says here in this book, is an unnatural act. Waiting for rain, for music. Burn me some music, send my roots rain. I'm swept dry from inside, hard winds rack my core. A struggle at the roots of the mind. Whoever said it would go on and on like this? Strap hanger, swaying inside a runaway car, palming a notebook scribbled in. Contraband calligraphy against the war, poetry wages against itself. Once under a shed's eaves, thunder drumming membrane of afternoon, electric scissors slitting the air, thick drops spattering few and far, we could smell it then a long way off. But where is the rain coming to soak this soil? Burn me some music. There's a tune, Neglect of Sorrow. I've heard it hummed or strummed my whole life long in many a corridor. Waiting for tomorrow, long after tomorrow should have come. On many an ear it should have fallen, but the bands were playing so loud. Thank you.
Compulsory heterosexuality. It is impossible to recreate from the distance of some 20 plus years since I first heard those words, the impact those two words had on me as a 19-year-old. It was like a lever was pulled and this iron gate that I hadn't really known was there went crashing up, and suddenly everything was clear. A lot for two words to do, but then that's what words can do. Now, the noun itself was not the problem per se. Heterosexuality certainly seemed to be working for some people, other people. It was really that potent little adjective, compulsory, smug in its assurance and its promised and inevitable ends, that was the issue. The way it yoked the unknowing or the semi-knowing or the nascently or confusedly feeling to a single way of being. This assumption, Rich wrote, of female heterosexuality seems to me in itself remarkable. It is an enormous assumption to have glided so silently into the foundations of our thought. And the most remarkable thing is that those two words weren't even from a poem. They were from an essay. But then the path she had set me on my way towards was that of a scholar and not a poet. And the full title of the essay was Compulsory Heterosexuality and the Lesbian Experience, an essay which sought to think about heterosexuality as a political institution and one in which women were not always the most robust of beneficiaries. The essay appeared in the feminist journal Signs in 1980, and as is appropriate for a radical manifesto in a 1982 pamphlet, it also appeared in the anthology Powers of Desire, but I met it in a volume whose title, Blood, Bread, and Poetry, blazons the rubrics in which I'm convinced, I think we all are convinced, that Adrienne Rich lived her life. A volume I bought my second week of college at the now defunct Montreal bookstore L'Androgyne and have with me today. Here are the lines Rich wrote in the foreword to this edition, 1986. Within the 3 years since I wrote Compulsory Heterosexuality, with its energy of hope and desire, the pressures to conform in a society increasingly conservative in mood have become more intense. The new rights messages to women have been precisely that we are the emotional and sexual property of men, and that the autonomy and equality of women threaten family, religion, and state. The institutions by which women have traditionally been controlled, patriarchal motherhood, economic exploitation, the nuclear family, compulsory heterosexuality, are being strengthened by legislation, religious fiat, media imagery, and efforts at censorship. In a worsening economy, the single mother trying to support her children confronts the feminization of poverty, which Joyce Miller of the National Coalition of Labor Union Women has named one of the major issues of the 1980s. The lesbian, unless in disguise, faces discrimination in hiring and harassments and violence in the street, even within feminist-inspired institutions, such as battered women's shelters and women's studies programs. Open lesbians are fired and others warned to stay in the closet. The retreat into sameness, assimilation for those who can manage it, is the most passive and debilitating of responses to political repression, economic insecurity, and a renewed open season on difference. These lines garnered some of the same responses from the participants and audience during the memorial reading we had at Columbia in the month after Adrienne's death, a room of men and women of all ages. And at that time, the words felt particularly poignant to me during months in which we listened to politicians and pundits call women who wanted contraception sluts, a story predicated on a kind of compulsory heterosexuality which confined women's sexuality even more tidily, not only to heterosexuality, but to marriage and reproduction. And during Todd Aiken's, now, I hope, permanently famous comments about how in cases of legitimate rape, women's bodies had the ability to shut that whole thing down and prevent conception, a fantasy that had as one of its many bases the view that compulsory heterosexuality was such a right that it could abut right up against rape, right up against biology, and trump them with its winning logic. It is perhaps a happier day now that he and others who shared or at least expressed his views have slunk into appropriate ignominy out of the race. But they were still said, and they will be said again. Of course, I have no wish to end with their words, although I believe resisting them with our own feminist words is what Rich would have wanted us to do. But rather, I want to end with her own words. Again, not from the essay itself, but from her considered response to a letter written to her by the feminists Anne Snitno, Christine Stansel, and Sharon Thompson about the controversy that the essay had solicited. To take misogyny seriously, she wrote, needn't mean that we perceive women merely as victims without responsibilities or choices. It does mean recognizing the necessity in that dialectic of necessity and choice, identifying, describing, refusing to turn aside our eyes. Thank you.
It's an honor to be with you to celebrate the life and work of such a great poet and friend. I want to start by reading a couple of poems from Adrienne's book, The Will to Change. I've been rereading her work these past months, kind of start to finish, and have really been struck by the recurrence of both those words, will and change, and by her confidence in the transformative power of the imagination. I dream I'm the death of Orpheus. I am walking rapidly through striations of light and dark thrown under an arcade. I am a woman in the prime of life with certain powers, and those powers severely limited by authorities whose faces I rarely see. I am a woman in the prime of life driving her dead poet in a black Rolls Royce through a landscape of twilight and thorns. A woman with a certain mission, which, if obeyed to the letter, will leave her intact. A woman with the nerves of a panther, a woman with contacts among hell's angels, a woman feeling the fullness of her powers at the precise moment when she must not use them. A woman sworn to lucidity, who sees through the mayhem, the smoky fires of these underground streets. Her dead poet learning to walk backward against the wind on the wrong side of the mirror. One of the things I've always loved about Adrienne is that she so passionately sought out the poetry and art that kind of cut across what most people thought of as competing aesthetic traditions. She was quick to see common ground where other people saw a difference. She loved Jean-Luc Godard, for instance, whose sexual politics she might have had a few things to say about. This is Images for Godard. Language as city, Wittgenstein. Driving to the limits of the city of words, the superhighway streams like a comic strip to newer suburbs, casements of shockproof glass where no one yet looks out, or toward the coast where even now the squatters in their shacks await eviction. When all conversation becomes an interview under duress, when we come to the limits of the city, my face must have a meaning. To know the extremes of light, I sit in this darkness, to see the present flashing in a rearview mirror, blued in a plate glass pane, reddened in the reflection of the red Triomphe parked at the edge of the sea glittering in the sun, the swirls of nebula in the espresso cup, raindrops, neon spectra on a vinyl raincoat. To love, to move perpetually as the body changes, a dozen times a day, the temperature of the skin, the feeling of rise and fall, dead weight and buoyancy, the eye sunk inward, the eye bleeding with speech. For that moment, at least, I was you. To be stopped, to shoot the same scene over and over. At the end of Alphaville, she says, I love you. And the film begins that you've said you'd never make because it's impossible. Things as difficult to show as horror and war and sickness are, meaning love, to speak in the mouth, to touch the breast for a woman, to know the sex of a man. That film begins here, yet you don't show it. We leave the theater suffering from that. Interior monologue of the poet. The notes for the poem are the only poem. the mind collecting, devouring all these destructibles. The unmade studio couch, the air shifting the abalone shells. The mind of the poet is the only poem. The poet is at the movies, dreaming the filmmaker's dream, but differently, free in the dark as if asleep, free in the dusty beam of the projector. The mind of the poet is changing. The moment of change is the only poem. As some of you may know, Adrienne had a beautiful wildness as a person, and she could be wickedly funny. One of the pleasures of knowing her and Michelle was the total delight of sharing their laughter and absolute irreverence in the face of authority. I don't hear a lot of humor in her work, but there's this fragment that I love of a poem from the early 1980s that I wanted to read. Dear Adrienne, I'm calling you up tonight as I might call up a friend, as I might call up a ghost, to ask what you intend to do with the rest of your life. Sometimes you act as if you have all the time there is. I worry about you when I see this. The prime of life, old age, aren't what they used to be. Making a good death isn't either. Now you can walk around the corner of a wall and see a light that already has blown your past away. Somewhere in Boston, beautiful literature is being read around the clock by writers to signify their dislike of this. I hope you've got something in mind. I hope you have some idea about the rest of your life. In sisterhood, Adrienne. The last time I visited Adrienne and Michelle, it was a few weeks before Adrienne died, and she had almost completely lost her eyesight. But she wanted to rearrange the books in her study and had a very particular plan about how to do it, so that certain books were near her and that she would know that they were there, like good friends, which they were. I'll end by reading a couple of her last poems, which you'll find in this beautiful new edition of her work. Tracings. This chair delivered yesterday, built for a large, heavy man, left me from his estate, lies sidewise, legs upturned. He would sit in the chair, spooked by his own thoughts. He would say to himself, as the fabric shrinks, the pattern changes, and forget to write it. He would want to say, the drug that ekes out life disenlivens life. I would see words float in the mirror behind his heaped desk as thought were smoke. The friends I can trust are those who will let me have my death. Traced on a rafter salvaged from a house marked for demolition. Skies a mottled marble slab, webs drift off a railing. There were voices here once, a defiance that still doesn't falter. Imagine a mind overhearing language split open, uncodified as yet or never. Imagine a mind sprung open to music, not the pitiless worm of a tune that won't let you forget it, but a scoreless haunting. And I think this might actually be her last poem. It's in 3 very small parts called End Papers. If the road's a frayed ribbon strung through dunes, continually drifting over, if the night grew green as sun and moon changed faces, and the sea became its own unlit, unlikely sound. Consider yourself lucky to have come this far. Consider yourself a trombone blowing unheard tones, a bass string plucked or locked down by a hand, its face articulated in shadow, pressed against a chain-link fence. Consider yourself inside or outside, wherever you were when knotted steel stopped you short. You can't flow through as music or as air. What holds, what binds is breath, is primal vision in a cloud's eye, is gauze around a wounded head, is bearing a downed comrade out beyond the numerology of vital signs into predictless space. The signature to a life requires the search for a method, rejection of posturing, trust in the witnesses, a vial of invisible ink, a sheet of paper held steady after the end stroke, above a deciphering flame. Thank you.
I first met Adrienne through a letter when I was 30, a letter that she wrote to me. And our last words to each other last January and February were through letters, saying hello and saying goodbye. We were friends for almost 50 years, and I know many of you will have known her your whole lives, or your whole lives in poetry and civic life. The first quality I loved her for was her generosity. From collective, sorry, I can't read that. The first quality I loved her for was her generosity to friends, to students, to less well-known poets, and to people in trouble. And her generosity runs through her whole lifetime of poems and her indispensable prose writings, along with her rare intelligence and her heroic, tough-minded dream of a common language. For tonight, I would like to read 2 sections from Leaflets, the poem whose title became the title of the book she was working on when we first became neighbors. I had read her poems deeply before, but these are still, as I heard someone say about Rilke, engraved on the inside of my head. Leaflets, section 2. Your face, stretched like a mask, begins to tear as you speak of Che Guevara, Bolivia, Nanterre. I'm too young to be your mother. You're too young to be my brother. Your tears are not political. They are real water, burning as the tears of Telemachus burned. Over Spanish Harlem, the moon swells up, a fire balloon, fire gnawing the edge of this crushed-up newspaper. Now the bodies come whirling, coal-black, ash-white, out of torn windows, and the death columns blacken, whispering, who'd choose this life? We're fighting for a slash of recognition, a piercing to the pierced heart. Tell me what you are going through. But the attention flickers and will flicker, a match flame in poison air, a thread, a hair of light, some of all answer to the know that I exist of all existing things. And this is the last section, section 5. The strain of being born over and over has torn your smile into pieces. Often I have seen it broken and then remembered and wondered how a beauty so anarch, so ungilded, will be cared for in this world. I want to hand you this leaflet streaming with rain or tears, but the words coming clear, something you might find crushed into your hand after passing a barricade and stuff in your raincoat pocket. I want this to reach you who told me once that poetry is nothing sacred, no more sacred, that is, than other things in your life. To answer yes, if life is uncorrupted, no better poetry is wanted. I want this to be yours, in the sense that if you find and read it, it will be there in you already, and the leaflet then merely something to leave behind, a little leaf in the drawer of a sublet room. What else does it come down to but handing on scraps of paper, little figurines or files, no stronger than the dry clay they are baked in, yet more than dry clay or paper, because the imagination crouches in them. If we needed fire to remind us that all true images were scooped out of the mud where our bodies curse and flounder, then perhaps that fire is coming to sponge away the scribes and time servers, and much that you would have loved will be lost as well before you could handle it and know it, just as we almost miss each other in the ill cloud of mistrust, who might have touched hands quickly, shared food, or given blood for each other. I am thinking how we can use what we have to invent what we need.
Thank you to the Y, to the other participants here, and to you, the participants there. We really appreciate it. Is that better? I was just saying thank you to the Y, to the wonderful poets who have presented tonight and will present, and to you. Thank you. I used to have more hair. I'm just going to read some remarks that I wrote, and then a poem. Courage, right? We speak of Adrienne Rich's courage as a thinker, a writer, as an activist. But what about the 21-year-old woman? In photos, she's really just a girl. Yes, anointed by Auden for the Yale Younger Poets Prize, but a 21-year-old listening intently to the doctor, a rheumatologist. This will be with you for life, this chronic joint disease, and it will get worse. How was that going to work? Determination, And you see it in these photos. I will do this. I will be all right. I am equal to this challenge. Courage, determination, faith. And the 30-year-old woman nursing this newborn as an almost 2-year-old and an almost 4-year-old fight for attention. When was she supposed to find the time to write? This young poet of such enormous promise. Faith. I can do this. I will do this. Faith, sometimes in just trace amounts, but faith, determination. 11 years later, the quality of the light on a brilliant October day, she's hanging up the phone, piecing together the words to carry news of her husband's suicide to their boys. Finding herself suddenly alone in the job of child rearing 3 boys coming into adolescence. How do you recover? How do you rebuild? And when would she ever write again, this poet of such acclaim? Courage, faith, determination. I will do this. I must do this. So then, a few years later, sending young men, boys, only barely equipped, out into the world. I know you've seen it. That documentary footage, it's shot on a long lens, and it's grasslands through a haze. A lioness rises up, turning her body abruptly, raising the dust. That movement is unmistakable to her young. So, determination, faith, courage. Here's what she told us at that time, with words, but really by example. You can do this. You will be all right. You are equal to this moment. You will be well received. People are fundamentally decent. You will make choices, and enough of them will be right. You will love, and you will be loved. And you will learn, sometimes by falling hard. And I'm always here. Courage. Courage. No, not her young. That lioness, feigning distraction, forcing herself not to watch her cubs as they amble away, sort of sideways into the grasses, overconfident, not confident enough. Courage, faith. I had no idea how much courage until we had to send a boy, Charlie, a young man really, until we had to send him out into the world. People are fundamentally decent, I told myself. He will make choices, and enough of them will be right. He will be loved, and he will love, and he will learn, sometimes by falling hard. And then recent years, that damned arthritis kept its word. And then her eyes, her eyesight. Let's be clear, her vision was undiminished. She lost her eyesight. So, how are you supposed to write? This poet, an essayist, an activist, this force of such magnitude, courage, determination, faith. The quality of the light at dusk on a day in March 2002. She had a manuscript all prepared, a final volume of poetry, a reminder of what's possible. And now I'm going to read a poem from 1985 from Time's Power. Face flashing free, child arms lifting the collie pup. Torn paper on the path, Central Park, April 72. Behind you, minimal, those benches and that shade, that brilliant light in which you laughed, long-haired, and I'm the keeper of this little piece of paper, this little piece of truth. I wanted this from you. Laughter, a child turning into a boy, at ease in the spring light, with friends. I wanted this for you. I could mutter, give back that day, give me again that child, with the chance of making it all right. I could yell, give back that light on the dog's teeth, the child's hair. But no rough drafts are granted. Do you think I don't remember? Did you think I was all-powerful, unimpaired, unappalled? Yes, you needed that from me. I wanted this from you.
I'm blinded by the lights. You know, there's so much I could say about Adrienne, but there are a few things that I must say about her. Jean Valentine spoke of her generosity, which I know firsthand over an enormous period of years. We met in the 60s, Adrienne and I. And she was always supportive, kind, helpful. When I say that when I think of her, in a way, I'm reminded of Keats. And that might sound a little nuts, because he was not a political poet. And he didn't have the range, perhaps, of her emotions. You feel so many different emotions in Adrienne's poetry, you know, all the way from rage to tenderness and love. But, you know, they're both small in stature. That was the first thing. And yet huge in their talent and their undertaking and their vision of what they wanted to do with their poetry, what they wanted to do with their lives. And there's another way in which I think they're very similar. You know, Keats died at 25. And yet, for those of us who love poetry, he is intensely alive. And Adrienne, though she's gone now, I have the same sense that her power, her personality, her poetry, who she was, how she dealt with people, will go on reverberating and reverberating. All the lives that she touched, she changed for the better. And that effect will go on for as long as we go on as human beings. Just the way Keats, dead now, close to 200 years, and we still feel his effect. Long after I'm dead, you people will be gathering in this room to hear people read Adrienne Rich. And I'm sorry I won't be part of it. I swear I'll do my best, but I'd like to read some poems by her. It's funny, every time I read her poetry, I hear her voice. And I hear that you're going to hear it afterwards, those of you who haven't already heard it. And it was a singular voice. It was like, I don't know, it's just there. And I won't try to imitate it because that would be ludicrous. And I'm a very serious man, as you all know. This is from a book, Midnight Salvage. And I live in Brooklyn half the year, and so this is a poem about Brooklyn, Plaza Street and Flatbush. Plaza Street and Flatbush. I'm only going to read one section. On a notepad, on a table, tagged for the goodwill, the word, Brooklyn. On the frayed luggage label, the matchbox cover, the name, Brooklyn. In steel-cut script, on a watermarked form, on a postcard, postmarked 1961, the word, Brooklyn. On the medal for elocution, on the ashtray with the bridge, the inscription, Brooklyn. In the beige notebook of the dead student's pride in her new language, on the union card, the love letter, the mortgaged insurance policy, somewhere it would say Brooklyn. On the sheer of the gull, on the ramp that sweeps to the great cable work, on the map of the 5 boroughs, the death certificate, the last phone bill, in the painter's sighting of light unseen till now in Brooklyn. And when I read that poem, when I think about it, and reading her poems again, I realize what a profound influence Hart Crane had on her. There were 2 American poets in the second half of the last century who, it seems to me, undertook poems as large as Crane's The Bridge. And one was Galway Canal's The Avenue Bearing the Initial of Christ into the New World, a marvelous poem. And the other is An Atlas of the Difficult World by Adrienne. And they're both marvelously successful. But I'm going to read something first from another poem before I read from that poem. This is called A Night Has 1,000 Eyes. It's a kind of corny, the title is, she puts it in quotation marks, it's a pretty corny love ballad. I can't remember the guy's name who sang it badly. But later on, Coltrane played it, and so did Freddie Hubbard, 2 marvelous jazz musicians. Part 1. The taxi meter clicking up, loose change. Who can afford to pay? Basalt blurring spectral headlights. Dark blue stabbed with platinum. Raincoats glassy with evening wet. The city gathering itself for darkness into a bitter chocolate vein. The east side with its trinkets. The west side with its memories. And in the last section of that poem, we hear her generosity right there. She salutes her heroes, most of them pretty well forgotten, except for Crane. And they are Hart Crane, Miles Davis, Muriel Rukeyser, Julia de Burgos, a Puerto Rican poet, and Paul Goodman, the poet, novelist, social gadfly, marvelous character. Roebling's Harbor Room is a reference to the room that Washington Roebling lived in when he was crippled but still supervised the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was the same room that Hart Crane started, exactly the same room. Hart Crane started writing The Bridge. It's not there anymore. The house was torn down. Can you believe it? By the way, Crane's father manufactured candy and would send it to his son, whose life he intensely disapproved of, here in New York. He was from Cleveland. We must learn in our long lives to forgive Cleveland. Now, I know it's not easy, but give it a try, you know. And throw in Detroit while you're there, you know. My hometown. The wrapped candies from Cleveland, the acclaim of East St. Louis, dead-weight trophies borne through interborough fissures of the mind in search of Charlie Parker. Where are you sleeping tonight? With whom? In crippled Roebling's harbor room where he watched his bridge transpire? Hart, Miles, Muriel, Julia, Paul, you will meet the eyes you were searching for, and the day will break as we say it breaks, as we don't say of the night, as we don't say of the night. And you've been a marvelously receptive and patient audience. I never get audiences like this. I mean, you know, I'm two lines into the first poem and I see them leaving. This is the last section of, and the last poem I'll read is the last section of this poem that I love so much. Before I read it, I want to tell you, it just occurred to me, a wonderful story, a true story. An Atlas of the Difficult World was nominated for the National Book Award, as was a book of mine. And Adrienne called me and said, the night before the awards were given, and they do it like the Academy Awards, they keep you, puzzled and anxious. They had a reading where everybody read for 3 minutes or something. Fiction writers, poets, whatever. Nonfiction, that's the other category. I shouldn't forget it. And we all read a few minutes. Well, Adrienne called me and said, let's meet before the event and have a drink. And I said, sure. And I can't remember the bar we met in, but it was a modest bar. And we sat at a table. And then we were talking about her kids and my kids, whom she knew. And suddenly she said to me, Phil, I'll be just as happy if you win the prize. And I thought about that. And I said to her, God, Adrienne, I wish I had your character and generosity. I really want to win. And then she said, well, of course, I want to win too, Phil. So that kind of honesty, I would never say that usually. I never would have said that. But her honesty just sort of provoked this ridiculous honesty in me, admitting my hideous selfishness. No, Adrienne, I want it, All right, this is the final section of this fabulous poem, An Atlas of the Difficult World. I know you are reading this poem late, before leaving your office, of the one intense yellow lamp spot and the darkening window in the lassitude of a building fading to quiet long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem standing up in a bookstore far from the ocean on a gray day of early spring, faint flakes driven across the plain's enormous spaces around you. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed, and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem by the light of the television screen, where soundless images jerk and slide, while you wait for the newscast from the Intifada. I know you are reading this poem in a waiting room, of eyes met and unmeeting, of identity with strangers. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light, in the boredom and fatigue of the young, who are count themselves out at too early an age. I know you are reading this poem through your failing sight, the thick lens enlarging these letters beyond all meaning, yet you read on because even the alphabet is precious. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short, and you too are thirsty. I know you are reading this poem, which is not in your language, guessing at some words, while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. I know you are reading this poem listening for something, torn between bitterness and hope, turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are. Thank you.
I'm just going to read a short letter of hers, and so I'm going to ask, because we're going to end with a recording of her reading at the 92nd Street Y. I'll just walk off, and you don't have to clap because it's a letter. Galway Cannell wanted very much to be here tonight, and he hated being prevented from traveling by the onset of a cold. And he sent a couple of letters he had from Adrienne that tell about her own experience of the onset of winter and other things. And I'm just going to read one of these. It's from March 21st, 2008. And it refers in the first paragraph to a letter that he had written to her. So she says, "Dear Galway, your letter came today. I too have felt my age this past winter, very cold and gray for this California coast, though nothing like Vermont. A mixture of the shortness of daylight, the brevity of life, my increased disabilities, and the sense of cultural degradation and public emergency, about which I will say no more. Now the light is lengthening, leaves uncurling, mockingbirds pouring out their riffs. I go walking with a four-wheel walker by the beach and at the fishing harbor where I listen to guys hanging around trucks reminiscing about past salmon and crab seasons and the sounds of boats creaking in their slips. Physically, I'm feeling much better these days, but from time to time, a sense of existential loss overwhelms me. Your words about telephone labyrinth mean the world to me. I've been able to write some poems in the past few months. Sometimes feel like those guys at the harbor remembering the great catches of yesteryear. I find I revise more severely than ever. Got a great lift from reading for the first time Hugh Kenner's The Pound era and rereading a lot of Hopkins, including letters. I wish we could sit and read poetry aloud to each other. We both have true partners, and that in this world is a wellspring. Please let me know how you are. With love, Adrienne." I'm deeply grateful to the 92nd Street Y for the remarkable way that they have taken up this evening, and I'm grateful to the co-sponsors, the Poets House, the Poetry Society of America, the Academy of American Poets, and the Stephen Barclay Agency, and W.W. Norton, which has been a home for Adrienne and her writing for what seems like forever, and continues tonight and beyond. It means so much to my brothers and I and to Michelle Cliff that these friends and colleagues and co-conspirators, Adrienne's, agreed to read and talk about her tonight, and it really, really does. We're also so grateful to all of you who are here with us, to all of Adrienne's readers and her listeners, fellow activists and friends. And over many, many, many years, even when she was no longer able to travel or give readings, you were a source of energy and inspiration to her. It was a relationship that ran both ways. This last is Camino Real from her reading at the 92nd Street Y.
This is called Camino Real, which is the Spanish name for Highway 101 in California. It's the old Spanish name, but it's still called El Camino. And it's a road I drive fairly frequently on my way to Los Angeles from where I live, and parts of it are very beautiful. And this is a poem which comes out of what has been for me a long time reflection and question, which is that in a world of profound misery, in a world in which life is made quite simply impossible for so many, what do we do with the periods of happiness, with our own sense of happiness, whoever we are, wherever we may find that? What does it mean? And I quote in this poem from two poets, one Charles Olson, who wrote in a poem called Meditations for Gerard Vandeville, "Can you afford not to make the magical study which happiness is?" And the other is from a letter that the poet George Oppen wrote to his sister in 1970, which is the epigraph for this book. I don't know how to measure happiness. Camino Real. Hot stink of skunk, crushed at the vineyard's edge, hawk-skied, carrion-clean clouds ranging themselves over enormous autumn. That scribble, edged and skunky, as the great road winds on toward my son's house 7 hours south. Walls of the underpass, smudged and blistered eyes gazing from armpits, the wanter wanted, armed in love and dangerous, wanted for wanting. To become the scholar of, to list, compare, contrast events, to footnote lesser evils, calmly to note bed springs, describe how they were wired to which parts of the body, to make clear-eyed assessments of the burnt-out eye, investigate the mouth bit and the mouth, the half-swole slippery flesh, the enforced throat, the whip they played you with, the backroad games, the beatings by the river. Oh, to list, collate, commensurate, to quantify. I was the one. I suffered. I was there. Never to trust to memory only, to go back, notebook in hand, dressed as no one there was dressed, over and over to quantify on a gridded notebook page. The difficulty of proving such things were done for no reason,
that every night in those years, people invented reasons for torture. Asleep now, head in hands, hands over ears. Oh, you who do this work, every one of you, every night. Driving south, Santa Barbara's barbarous landscaped mind, lest it be forgotten in the long sweep down coast. Let it not be exonerated, but oh, the light on the raw Pacific silks. Charles Olson, can you afford not to make the magical study which happiness is? I take him to mean that happiness is in itself a magical study, a glimpse of the unhandicapped life as it might be for anyone, somewhere, a kind of alchemy, a study of transformation, else it withers, wilts. That happiness is not to be mistrusted or wasted, though it ferment in grief. George Oppen to June Degnan, I don't know how to measure happiness. Why measure? In itself, it's the measure. At the end of a day of great happiness, if there be such a day, drawn by love's unprovable pull, I write this, sign it, Adrienne.